there was this constant tension between whether the overriding goal was getting rid of Saddam Hussein or whether the overriding goal was gaining confidence through a new round of inspections that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction.
Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Melvin Leffler. Mel is Emeritus Professor of American History at the University of Virginia and the author of several books on the Cold War and U.S. relations with Europe, including For the Soul of Mankind, A Preponderance of Power, and Safeguarding Democratic Capitalism. He's also the co-editor of Shaper of Nations, Strategies for a Changing World, and the Cambridge History of the Cold War. He joins me today for a discussion of his 2023 book called Confronting Saddam Hussein, George W. Bush and the Invasion of Iraq. Dr. Melvin Leffler, it's a pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Look forward to talking with you.
You were a student at Cornell University during the Vietnam War. I'm interested to ask you how what was going on domestically and abroad with the Vietnam War affected you and influenced the development of your thinking at that time.
Indeed, I was a student, an undergraduate student at Cornell in the mid-1960s when protests against the Vietnam War began. Initially, they were very small protests on college campuses. Cornell was a hotbed of anti-war activity. By no means was I a leader, but the protests and the focus on Vietnam engaged my interest at the time, and it shaped my overall eventual focus on American foreign policy. I became deeply interested in the causes for America's engagement in Vietnam. I became convinced by the protests and by the teachings at Cornell University that the war in Vietnam was wrong-headed and that the United States was making a serious error. As a result of that engagement, I began a long-term inclination to become involved in the study of American foreign policy. However, I must emphasize that my primary focus during my last year at Cornell University was studying American labor history, and I purposefully went to graduate school at Ohio State University in order to study labor history with a very young, prominent labor historian named David Brody. Alas, during my first year at Ohio State, David Brody was on leave, and then he never returned. He took a job elsewhere. So I had no advisor at Ohio State University. And it was at that time that my deep interest in the war in Vietnam led me to really focus intensively on the study of the history of American foreign policy. That's when I really became involved in serious professional examination of the history of American foreign relations.
Would you mind sharing with me a couple of writers who influenced you as a young man and influenced you in how you think and how you write?
Yes, well, there were a number of historians, but I think that, simply stated, the writings of William A. Williams, Gabriel Coco, and the Wisconsin revisionists like Walter Lefebvre, Thomas McCormick, Lloyd Gardner, Carl Perini, they were the people that initially greatly influenced the way I approached the study of the history of American foreign relations. There are other political scientists, IR scholars whose work influenced me in my early years. Especially some of the writings of Bob Jervis, who book Perception and Misperception in International Politics introduced me to the whole study of threat perception, security dilemmas, and things of that sort, concepts that have enormously influenced my work over the years. Some of the realist international relations scholars like Ken Waltz and Then John Mearsheimer had a significant impact on me. John Gaddis's writings on the early Cold War shaped my thinking and engaged me in lots of subsequent debates. But by far and away, in the early years of my study of the history of American foreign policy, which actually did not focus on the Cold War and did not focus on any of the contemporary issues, but was focused on American policy toward France and Western Europe in the years after World War I, from 1918 to 1933. By far and away, the framework for much of my thinking was the Wisconsin revisionists. Interestingly, I was influenced by them, but as many of them would tell you, I never became an integral part of the Wisconsin school. I often was engaging them in debates and arguments. But the hypothesis that, the United States was always engaged in international relations, that the United States was never an isolationist nation, that economic factors had shaped American foreign policy from the very inception of the American Republic, that policymakers in the United States always believed that open door commerce was essential to the well-being of America's national interest. Those ideas were embedded in me, and they were constantly shaping the questions I asked myself as I conducted my own research. I increasingly became engaged in the issue of priorities in terms of thinking about American foreign policy. What priorities really shaped American decision makers? How did they determine what were vital interests in contrast to important interests or tertiary interests? How did policymakers really come to distinguish, and how does the investigator, the historian, make decisions about how policymakers or what policymakers thought were most important? Anyway, this is a long-winded answer to your question of, what shaped my thinking. The Wisconsin revisionists created a very significant framework. Subsequent to that, of course, my writings on the Cold War were heavily influenced by my engagement with the writings of John Lewis Gaddis. I was both influenced by him, and I also wound up debating him time and time again. And so most observers thought that we were inveterate opponents of one another. And I think in many ways, however, rather than being strictly opponents, we wound up shaping one another's thinking in important ways. I still strongly disagree with John Gaddis about many things about Cold War policies, but certainly his writings were very influential in the evolution of my own scholarship.
Wow, thank you for that answer. It's interesting for me to learn these kinds of details about the influences in a scholar's early career. I'd like now to move to your book, Confronting Saddam Hussein. You wrote at the beginning of this book that you were influenced by a man named Eric Edelman. Would you please introduce who Eric Edelman is and how he helped you with the writing of this book?
Yes, Eric Edelman was indispensable to the writing of this book. I met him initially, I think, around the year 2009, when he came to the University of Virginia to give a talk. He was a professional Foreign Service officer with a PhD in history from Yale. But he didn't go into the academic world. He entered the Foreign Service, and he was immediately perceived as a very brilliant young foreign service officer. By the middle 1990s, first he was a very close advisor to Strobe Talbott, who was the Democratic Deputy Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. Then subsequently, Eric Edelman became a foreign policy expert on the staff of Vice President Dick Cheney. And then he went on to be ambassador to Turkey, and then came back and was Undersecretary of Defense when Donald Rumsfeld was beginning the second term inside the Bush administration. So 2005, 2006, I guess it was, and 2007 that Eric Edelman was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Anyway, he came to the University of Virginia to give a talk. I met him. We had lunch together. He was very familiar with the history of the Cold War and with my writings on the Cold War. And he encouraged me to undertake a study of the Bush administration's decision to go to war in Iraq. Once again, this is around 2009. He did that because he knew I had written one or two very short articles about the impact of 9/11 on American foreign policy. And now he encouraged me to write a real book about it. And I said that I really couldn't write a book about that because there were insufficient primary sources. I was an archives type of historian. I had always relied on a lot of primary documents in various archives and manuscript collections. And I said to Eric, no such documents or very few such documents are going to be accessible in the near future. Eric said to me, well, that was true, but that some documents would be declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests and mandatory declassification requests. But most importantly, he said to me, if I embarked on such a study, he would enable me to have interviews, or he would help set up interviews with other leading members of the George W. Bush administration. And I thought that was interesting. I didn't commit myself. I said I would think about it. About 2 weeks later, Eric Edelman wrote me an email message and said, well, are you going to write this book? And I said to him something like, well, are you going to set up the interviews for me? And he said, sure, I will. And before I knew it, he had set up, within days, he had contacted Paul Wolfowitz and Steve Hadley and Scooter Libby. And I then began having interviews with those people. And I was not really totally committed to writing the book. I wanted to see how the interviews would go. But Eric Edelman's introductions to key policymakers on the sort of neoconservative side of the political spectrum, people like Scooter Libby and Paul Wolfowitz, those interviews got me started. Subsequently, other people in the administration with different types of political leanings helped facilitate my interviews with other people like Secretary of State Colin Powell, Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. Still other scholars helped me get interviews with some of the top intelligence analysts, including George W. Bush's daily CIA briefer, Michael Morrell. And so what I can say is that Eric Edelman was indispensable because he catalyzed these oral interviews that went on literally for almost a decade. I would say a decade. I carried on these oral interviews, sometimes going back to same people several times, always expanding the purview of the interviews. So the interviews that I had with top policymakers constitute a core element for the documentation of my book. However, I want to stress that by no means did I exclusively rely on these oral interviews with decision makers. I was extraordinarily well aware that in many ways, they were far more able to shape my thinking than I was able to probe them. I knew they were all masters of oral interviews, or almost all of them were. I was exceedingly well aware of this, and hence I committed myself to accessing as much primary source documentation as I could possibly get my hands on. And over the years, over almost a decade of investigation, any reader of my book can see that I accessed a lot of declassified documents, documents that were declassified partly or largely by the aid of other institutions like the National Security Archive. I also relied heavily on British documents from a big British parliamentary inquiry called the Chilcot Inquiry about why Britain went to war on the side of the United States. And those British interviews, I can talk about that more later, but those British interviews of all top British decision makers, plus the fact that the British, in conjunction with this commission's investigation, actually declassified a huge number of British documents. Now, those were all about British foreign policy, but very frequently British policymakers, including Prime Minister Tony Blair, Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, and on, all the top British policymakers spoke extensively about their ongoing interactions with American officials. So David Manning, who was Tony Blair's key foreign policy advisor, talked a lot about his meetings with Condi Rice, George W. Bush's national security advisor. So those British documents were extremely helpful to me. I also relied on captured Iraqi documents, which were taken from Baghdad after American troops went into Iraq. Many documents were brought back to the United States. Many hundreds, maybe thousands of them were translated into English. I don't read Arabic, so I relied on the English translations of these documents. But these Iraqi documents, including, of course, some of the tapes of Saddam Hussein's meetings with his own advisors, these Iraqi documents contributed significantly to the research base of my book. And then finally, toward the end of my book, I used a lot of UN documents, published UN documents, to examine the role of UN inspectors inside Iraq when they were finally allowed in the fall of 2002. So Eric Edelman set up these interviews, which were indispensable to the book. But I also think the book is heavily influenced by the actual written documentation that has become available. I should simply say in conclusion, the amount of archival evidence, however, remains extremely slim compared to what will eventually emerge. The declassified American documents that we now have to this day remain a tiny percentage of what I know will eventually become available.
Moving to the 9/11 attacks and the Bush administration's response to it, I was struck reading this book by how you evoked their sense of fear that more attacks were coming. I guess I didn't quite realize the degree to which they were under this pressure, not just to find who was responsible for them, but that more attacks were coming. Could you share a little about how they had this feeling of certainty that another attack was coming, and that was weighed against the uncertainty of having little idea from where it was going to come or how it was going to come?
Yes, well, the focus on threat perception is a key contribution of my book. Often in other accounts, the fears of American decision makers are trivialized or minimized. What I show in my book, and what I think is unquestionably the case, was the overwhelming apprehension that the attack on 9/11 was the first of many sequential attacks. The fear was based on ongoing evidence that the Al-Qaeda group of terrorists who had orchestrated the attack on 9/11 were intent on subsequent attacks. Indeed, many analysts believed, many observers believed that the subsequent attacks might even be of greater magnitude than the one on 9/11. What contributed to these fears was the ongoing daily intelligence assessments of incoming information suggesting that there were plans for another attack. There was fear inside the White House, as I illuminate in my book, of the likelihood of chemical or biological attack inside the White House. There was tremendous worry about an ongoing attack with weapons of mass destruction. That was the common terminology that began to be used. And when policymakers talked about weapons of mass destruction in terms of the ongoing imminent threat, they had in mind the employment of chemical or biological weapons. And of course, the fact that the reality of anthrax spores being disseminated inside the United States in the mail and the postal system, the reality of it hugely accentuated these worries. Just for example, the Senate office buildings were closed down. The Supreme Court stopped meeting in its own building and began conducting its deliberations elsewhere. I was then a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, and access to books from the Library of Congress was circumscribed. Mail was interfered with. I mean, there was a sense that there was going to be another attack. And Michael Morrell, who was George W. Bush's daily briefer, describes in his memoir, as does George Tenet, who was the head of the CIA, how they walked over sometimes to the White House from the executive office building sometimes, and as they walked, they worried and pondered the possibility of an imminent attack. Now, these worries were then accentuated in November of 2001. Now, we're talking just 2 months after 9/11. These apprehensions were hugely accentuated when American special forces, along with the groups of some insurgent Afghan forces together, overthrew the Taliban government inside Afghanistan. The Taliban government was overthrown, and American special forces, along with the Northern Alliance groups, these ethnic groups that special forces work with, entered the Al-Qaeda training camps inside Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda terrorists had been located inside Afghanistan, and they had dispersed, of course, when the United States made it clear that it was going to overthrow the Taliban government and deploy forces to Iraq. The Al-Qaeda terrorists dispersed from their camps. But when special forces arrived at those camps, they found unmistakable evidence that Al-Qaeda leaders were seeking to acquire or develop chemical and biological weapons. This reinforced the apprehensions that already existed that another attack with even more devastating weapons could happen inside the United States. And as I show in my book, that in the weeks after the attack on 9/11, American intelligence analysts developed what they called a threat matrix. And each day, George Tenet, the head of the CIA, and Michael Morrell, the CIA briefer, would go to the White House with literally a list, what they called a threat matrix, a list of all the possible suggestions, all the possible information, all the information that had come in during the prior 24 hours of an impending attack. And the policymakers and the analysts describe how George W. Bush would go over with Michael Morrell and George Tenet each of the possibilities that had simply arrived during the last 24 hours. And sometimes there were dozens of them. And Bush would say, tell me about number 5, tell me about number 19, tell me about number 26. This simply illustrates the magnitude of the threat and the quantity of information about the likelihood of a follow-up attack on the United States. This was what hugely increased fears of another attack during the months immediately following 9/11. And this led inevitably to a focus on Iraq. And I'm sure you'll ask me why at some point.
Yes. Their number one goal was the security of the American people and preventing another attack. And finding those documents in the terrorist camps in Afghanistan that they were seeking weapons of mass destruction to use in such potential attacks. That, combined with the fact that Saddam Hussein celebrated the attacks of 9/11 and in the past had weapons of mass destruction. Did everyone in the intelligence groups and Bush administration, and including in British intelligence groups, believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? Was he included in the focus because of the potential that he could give them to terrorists that would use them against the American people?
Yes, that's exactly the case. What I found in the documentary record was that the intelligence agencies, both in the United States and Britain, pretty much believed in the fall of 2001, at the time of the 9/11 attack, shortly after the 9/11 attack, most of the intelligence agencies believed that Saddam Hussein's Iraq had the capability to produce chemical and biological weapons, and perhaps already had, and perhaps still retained some stockpile of chemical weapons. They did not think that Saddam Hussein's nuclear capabilities were any sort of imminent threat whatsoever. They thought that he might be reigniting his programs, but the focus on a nuclear threat was minuscule. But they believed that Saddam Hussein either had some stockpile of chemical weapons or the possibility to produce chemical and biological weapons. This was what the intelligence agencies believed. However, they recognized that the information they had was far from conclusive. they recognized that the information they possessed was flimsy in many ways. Nonetheless, those were the conclusions that they drew, and those conclusions were communicated to President Bush and his top advisors. Michael Morrell, his daily briefer, said to me personally in an interview, and also wrote in his memoir, that looking at the evidence many, many years later that they then had, he would still have concluded, any reasonable person, he says, would have come to the same conclusions. But they should have told President Bush, and they did not tell him, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the evidence was flimsy. The accuracy of the evidence was not communicated. Nonetheless, I would say, and I write in the book, that although there is so much discussion about what the intelligence agencies collected and how they analyzed the information they collected, I emphasize that the findings of intelligence agencies were not the determinative influence on the beliefs of the policymakers themselves. What was determinative was the policymakers' knowledge that Saddam Hussein had once had weapons of mass destruction, that he had employed weapons of mass destruction, meaning mostly chemical weapons, both against the Iranians in the war, in the Iran-Iraq war, and also Saddam Hussein had employed chemical weapons against his Kurdish dissidents. Policymakers knew that subsequent to the war in Kuwait and the beginning of UN inspections, Saddam Hussein had lied repeatedly about his weapons of mass destruction, and policymakers knew that their own agencies had hugely underestimated the commitment of Saddam Hussein's regime in the late 1980s and 1990 and 91 to developing nuclear weapons. So what policymakers knew was that Saddam Hussein had developed weapons of mass destruction, had used weapons of mass destruction, and had lied about them. That was what really shaped the overall belief systems of the top decision makers. And yes, I found that all of the top decision makers, all of them believed that Saddam Hussein had chemical or biological weapons or could develop them very, very rapidly. Every single one of them. And I see this in the actual documentation, and in my interviews, I focused on that question again and again, not only with the top decision makers themselves, but I also asked this to many of the analysts and the subordinates to the top decision makers. You know, did your boss really think that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction? I did not find, I don't think a single person, maybe I'm overstating in retrospect, but let me just emphasize the vast, vast majority of top decision makers believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, meaning chemical or biological weapons, or could develop them very quickly, meaning weeks or months. Let me also state, however, that the certainty about Saddam's possession of weapons of mass destruction did not mean that there was certainty about Saddam's links to Al-Qaeda or to other terrorist groups. These are two actually separate questions that are often conflated with one another. And so it was a much more murky question about whether Saddam Hussein actually had links to al-Qaeda. What policymakers did know for certain was that Saddam Hussein did have links with other terrorist groups, and that Saddam Hussein was an enthusiastic supporter of suicide missions. This policymakers did know. Almost all of them believed that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11 itself. I very much believe, based on the evidence I've seen and based on my interviews, that George W. Bush did not think that Saddam Hussein was linked to 9/11. Nor did George W. Bush really think that Saddam Hussein was closely linked to al-Qaeda. However, he did fear, as did most policymakers, that Saddam did have links to many terrorist groups, and that it was possible that he might hand off chemical or biological weapons to one or another of these terrorist groups. I write in my book, and other commentators have questioned this generalization about the likelihood of his handing off weapons to other terrorist groups, even if he had them. And I do think that that issue of the likelihood was not sufficiently explored. But it's very, very important to know that the issue was not about, was as you yourself suggested, the analytic issue was not so much about Saddam Hussein's links to 9/11. The absolutely overriding issues that policymakers were confronting related to preventing another terrorist attack, especially preventing another terrorist attack on the United States with weapons of mass destruction, chemical or biological weapons. It was not so much about revenge or retaliation, although, believe me, there was a great desire for revenge. But the overriding policy focus was thwarting another attack.
And one of the lessons that President Bush drew from the 9/11 attacks was that he cannot take chances with these threats, that he has to take all of them seriously. And Saddam Hussein and the potential, whether it was likely or not, the potential that he could give weapons of mass destruction to a terrorist group and that could be used against the American people was a threat that they took very seriously. In December of 2001, he had a meeting, I think it was on his ranch in Crawford, with General Tommy Franks, and he asked the general to update the war planning for Iraq. This is in 2001 that this occurred. Could you say, I think this is an important thing that you write in your book. You write that up until 2003, there's not necessarily certainty that they're going to go to war. There's a difference between war planning and a commitment to go to war. Could you talk about the differences between those two things and why he had that meeting with General Tommy Franks?
Yes. The meeting with Tommy Franks, who was the commander of Central Forces, Central Command for the United States, took place around Christmas time, 2001, which, keep in mind, is like 3 months after 9/11, and about a month, 3, 4, 5 weeks after the successful overthrow of the Taliban government in Afghanistan. That successful overthrow of the Taliban government and the ongoing efforts to create a new provisional government in Afghanistan infused American policymakers with a tremendous amount of confidence about their ability to successfully employ force to bring about regime change, which they had just done in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, you had a regime, the Taliban regime, which clearly aided the terrorist group of Al Qaeda, or at least provided a training ground for Al Qaeda terrorists. And the global war on terrorism that the Bush administration announced immediately after the 9/11 attack meant that the regime that meant that the Bush administration would not only go after terrorists, but also would go after regimes that supported terrorists. And one of those likely regimes seemed to be Iraq, for the reason that you alluded to earlier. At least one of the reasons was that Saddam Hussein, at least initially, applauded the attacks on 9/11, and because of this ongoing intelligence that I've already talked about. So Bush, as a result of this, decided that it was time to review the war plans that existed for American use of force in Iraq. War plans that had been developed, for the first Persian Gulf War in 1990-91, and then updated during the 1990s. For the most part, since the late 90s, the war plans had not been reviewed and updated. And so Bush now asked Tommy Franks to come to Crawford, Texas, and to talk to him about the updating of the war plans, which Rumsfeld had instructed General Franks to begin work on in the preceding weeks, the middle of December. The war planning, however, I emphasize in my book, war planning does not mean going to war. And I show in my book time and time again that Rumsfeld emphasized that very fact. You need to update the war plans, but no decision has yet been made to go to war. And when President Bush met with General Franks that day, right around Christmas Day, and on subsequent occasions, I show in my book, President Bush kept urging General Franks to continue revising, updating, modernizing the war plan, making it more effective. But at the same time, almost on every occasion, stated, remember, this does not mean the United States is going to go to war, but I want to be prepared to go to war. What has become known, actually, in the years since I wrote my book, in the last 18 months or so, what has become known is how agitated Bush had been after the 9/11 attack, that there were no plans to deal with the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. No war plans really existed. And he was extraordinarily frustrated and exasperated by that fact. And so now, in part, war planning meant I want to be ready to be able to employ American forces to deal with Saddam Hussein if I decide that it is necessary to do so. So the big idea that I'm saying here, and that's often obfuscated or neglected, is that war planning did not, in December 2001 or in the early months of 2002, war planning did not mean that Bush had decided to go to war. Actually, it was part of a policy that they came to call coercive diplomacy.
That's one of the really important parts of your book. There's a whole chapter devoted to coercive diplomacy. Could you give a brief overview of what that was and some of the ambiguities that were associated with how the Bush administration pursued that policy, that diplomacy?
Yes, the whole idea was to sort of combine the threat of the use of force with the employment of diplomacy to either bring about regime change in Iraq or to force Saddam Hussein to open up Iraq again to UN inspectors and to compel him to demonstrate that Iraq really did have no weapons of mass destruction. Coercive diplomacy meant combining the threat of force with the use of diplomacy. The use of diplomacy was implemented by the administration's eventual commitment to try to get the United Nations to pass another resolution that would apply pressure on Saddam Hussein's regime to allow back the inspectors and to demonstrate to the inspectors that there were no weapons of mass destruction. This ultimately involved extensive discussions with members of the Security Council. But this happened mainly in the fall of 2002, September and October, November 2002. It was the idea of conducting diplomacy to get the UN to apply its own pressure through a new Security Council resolution on Iraq. But at the same time, the coercive factor was the commitment to begin to mobilize American forces to demonstrate the likelihood of an impending attack on Iraq if Saddam Hussein did not comply with a new UN resolution. One has to keep in mind during this entire period of time, let's say, we're talking from the fall of 2001 to the fall of 2002, for, roughly 10, 11, 12 months, Saddam Hussein kept refusing to allow back the UN inspectors who might have concluded that Iraq really didn't have weapons of mass destruction. American policymakers, British policymakers, leaders of UN inspection team like Hans Blix himself, they all believed that only under the threat of force would Saddam Hussein allow back inspectors and comply with previous UN resolutions about demonstrating that he had no weapons of mass destruction. Everyone believed that threatening force was indispensable to elicit Saddam Hussein's concessions. And so that was really what coercive diplomacy was about. What I show in the book, there were a lot of problems with coercive diplomacy. It was not well thought out. And one of the primary problems with coercive diplomacy was that President Bush himself never decided if his overriding priority was regime change, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, or if his overriding priority was securing a new round of inspections and getting confirmation that Saddam Hussein really had no weapons of mass destruction, or eliminating those that he did have. there was this constant tension between whether the overriding goal was getting rid of Saddam Hussein or whether the overriding goal was gaining confidence through a new round of inspections that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction.
When the decision was made to attack, what were the differing opinions around the president about what the end goal of the attack should be? So I think this is, out of all the crucial things we're talking about, this one might be the most crucial and consequential for how things turned out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, but it starts with the with the premise in your query about when the decision was made. And what I show in my book was that there was so much ambiguity about when the decision, in fact, was made by President Bush to invade Iraq. And both the written documentation is vague about this. There's a huge amount of documentation about discussing war plans and all of this. There's a lot of documentation about the deployment of forces. But it's very hard to find documentation of Bush's actual decision to go to war until maybe mid-January 2003 or February of 2003, when I asked Bush's closest advisors about when the president decided to go to war. There was an amazing amount of disparity in their responses. Some people, said, well, I knew in July. Others said, no, I didn't really know until the fall of 2002. Some said, oh, December 2002 was the turning point. I think Condi Rice, National Security Advisor, thinks the turning point was early January 2003, when Bush irrevocably made up his mind. Michael Gerson, his speechwriter and someone with whom Bush was very close, and Steve Hadley, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor, weren't even certain in January 2003 whether Bush was committed to going to war. Many of them hoped and still believed, or really I think the right word is hoped, that Saddam Hussein would make concessions or would flee Iraq, or that generals inside Iraq would either overthrow Saddam or kill him. And so the question about the decision to go to Iraq is when it was actually made remains a baffling question. And I think the answer is, as I show in my book, that it remained uncertain until much later than people heretofore have thought. Then you're asking about what were the goals, and that's an extraordinarily important question. So I would say to you, and I show in my book with a good deal of evidence, that for President Bush, if he decided to actually deploy forces to Iraq, if he actually decided to go to war, he wanted the war to end with the removal of Saddam Hussein, the assurance that there were no weapons of mass destruction inside Iraq, and the establishment of something along the lines of a democratic government or a free Iraq, however vaguely contemplated. Bush believed, I want to emphasize, President Bush did not go to war to promote democracy in Iraq, but having decided to go to war because of national security reasons, he did want the result of going to war to be a free and democratic Iraq. There's no question in my mind that George Bush cared about that was important to him. However, I show in the book, most importantly, for Donald Rumsfeld, creating a free, democratic Iraq was an inconsequential objective. Donald Rumsfeld, in my opinion, based on the evidence and the oral interviews, Donald Rumsfeld cared not a whit about promoting freedom or creating democratic institutions or even in reconstructing Iraq. He did not care about those things, nor did General Franks, who was the commander of American forces. What Franks and Rumsfeld were committed to and what they wanted were the first two objectives I mentioned: getting rid of Saddam Hussein and making sure there were no weapons of mass destruction inside Iraq. That's all they cared about. They didn't care about reconstructing Iraq, promoting democracy in Iraq, because neither Franks, the key commander, nor Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, because neither of them cared really much about promoting democracy or reconstructing Iraq. It meant that insufficient effort and coordination went into the planning for post-war Iraq. So there's this great gap between what President Bush would have liked to happen in Iraq after the invasion and what Rumsfeld and General Franks really cared about. And I show in the last chapter of my book that this ambiguity about objectives, and more specifically, the poor planning and the poor communication amongst policymakers, meant that the invasion quickly turned into a tragic fiasco and a devastating ultimate defeat for American prestige and for America's image in the world.
Conscious of the time, I think I should ask you my last question, Dr. Leffler. I like asking authors how they come up with the title for their book or the subtitle for their book. And with the title of this book, Confronting Saddam Hussein, I'm interested in the choice of the word confronting. Why did you think that was an appropriate title for this book?
I must say, I thought long and hard about that title. And I think you're the first person who has interviewed me who has actually asked this very, very important question that gets to the heart of the book, actually, and gets to the points that I was just now underscoring. I called the book Confronting Saddam Hussein because it really implies ambiguity about what was confronting Saddam Hussein. The administration and George W. Bush himself did want to confront Saddam Hussein, but they didn't know exactly what they really wanted to achieve. I show throughout the book this very ambiguity about the goals of the Bush administration. Everyone was agreed that Saddam was a terrible guy. He was a terrible, terrible leader. And I spent a whole chapter illuminating the career of Saddam Hussein in order to for my readers to understand why policymakers thought that he was such a brutal menace. They had good reason to think that. And so they wanted to confront him, but confronting did not necessarily mean going to war. One of the important parts of my book that conflicts with what a lot of other people have written is that although policymakers, from the time they took office in January 2001, before 9/11, they all hated Saddam Hussein. They all wanted to confront him, but it did not mean that they had decided upon going to war or invading Iraq. Those concerns actually, or that objective of going to war or invading Iraq only really became a truly salient consideration after 9/11. Before then, policymakers did discuss what should we do to confront Saddam Hussein. I mean, should we support covert actions? Should we, support the ability of Saddam's opponents to establish an enclave in the south of Iraq or the north of Iraq? There were many such discussions, but there was never agreement. There was never agreement about what to do with Saddam Hussein, although there was agreement that they should confront him in some way. And then after 9/11, they knew they had to deal with Saddam Hussein. They knew they wanted to get him to comply with the former UN resolutions about allowing inspectors back into Iraq. They knew they needed to confront Saddam Hussein in order to compel compliance with previous UN resolutions. Some also believed they needed to confront Saddam Hussein in order to overthrow him, in order to promote regime change. But there was discord amongst the policymakers themselves. And also, most importantly, there was discord inside the minds of policymakers. I mean, Bush himself had, I show at different times, had different priorities. He was uncertain. Is my major goal getting rid of Saddam Hussein? Is my major goal getting Saddam's compliance with the UN resolutions? Is my major goal guaranteeing that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction? Or is my major goal promoting democracy? These things conflicted inside Bush's mind and inside the minds of most American policymakers, even while they agreed that they needed to confront Saddam Hussein. Ultimately, confronting Saddam Hussein culminated in the invasion of Iraq, and that's why my subtitle is George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq. Confronting Saddam Hussein ultimately culminated in an invasion that went awry, that turned into a fiasco because of poor planning and poor coordination. But that invasion was not inevitable from the first moment that George W. Bush took office.
Right. And it's even, I think, one step better than that, too, because Saddam's name in Arabic, I think, means one who confronts. So there are many great meanings to this title.
Right.
I really appreciate your time that you took to talk to me today. I think this is an incredibly valuable book, and the research and time you put into it is really commendable. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for the interview. Really enjoyed the opportunity to discuss the book, a book that actually has received a lot of attention and that I think does force people to think hard about the challenges and dilemmas of decision making.
Mission accomplished.